Centaurs or Cyborgs podcast. This is an AI and machine learning podcast. I'm Nicholas DeVoe. I'm a programmer, data scientist, and occasional entrepreneur. I'm being joined today by my friend Ted Price. Ted studied astrophysics at Princeton University, where he was the likely only student, potentially ever, to have a bottle of Goldschlager in his student locker.
Yes, that is true.
And also discovered, running Python code, the furthest known quasar to humanity. Is that right?
Yeah. The furthest gravitationally lensed quasar.
The furthest known gravitationally lensed quasar.
Yeah.
Which that discovery put you on a bunch of email chains your senior year, did it not?
On email chains and on a paper.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unwittingly, I was just doing what my professor said, and then he's like, "Oh, hey, you found this thing."
So you happened to analyze data that was new data, or was it a new approach to data analysis?
It was in the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, and we basically were looking for these things that had like a very high redshift, which means they're really far away, but they were also not just a point source function. So the code would identify things that were like not like a point, but were bigger than a point, and then they fit within this like model of some magnitude. And then they were also highly redshifted. So usually things that are really redshifted are very small. They're like and so they look like a point to the computer.
Yeah.
But if they were not, then there was something wrong. So either it was like a mistake, which 99% of the time was a mistake, or it was like a quasar that was behind a galaxy, and when the light came to us, it bent around the galaxy, and so you saw two quasars basically. So it was lensed around the gravitational field of the galaxy. So we found one, and it was like a very highly redshifted one, basically.
So very, very far away.
Very far away.
Moving very fast.
Yeah.
So today we're going to discuss cyborgs, centaurs. We're going to go into one of the more science fiction-y discussions, I think, because Ted, when Ted is into something, he's very into it.
Yeah.
Like, you can recite many lines from Shakespeare, or even more from Top Gun, which you've seen more than 100 times, I think.
Yeah, something like that.
And I should also mention Ted is a commercial airline pilot, entrepreneur, and close friend of mine. And I figured we would record today a discussion about AI, definitions in AI, where we think it's going, and how it will affect specifically the industry that Ted works in.
Yeah.
So.
And I'm pretty new in the airline industry. I've been a pilot for a long time, but I'm learning a lot of stuff about the airline, so it's interesting to kind of apply the knowledge I've had from the past to these types of things. And
previous to the airline industry, you started a company.
I started a company, and I was a pilot. I've been a pilot for a long time.
And the company has no AI
not
presence.
Really. I think they're trying to do some AI stuff, but I'm not super involved in the product anymore.
Not day to day.
Yeah.
Yeah. So first, let's talk about cyborgs. So a cyborg is a cybernetic organism, and one of its most well-known moments in mainstream culture was in Star Trek, right?
Yes. And I'm a huge Trekkie, so that's
that's
another intersection point here.
Absolutely. So what is a cyborg, at least from the Trekkie perspective?
Well, there's this race of humanoids called the Borg, and basically they're a collective of species from around the galaxy, and they have like nanoprobes in them, like machines, and the machines basically control their mind so that they are all part of the collective mind. So all the information and all the history and all the technology and all the knowledge of all these cultures that are part of this collective hive are together. And so they can make decisions together, they can make very effective decisions, and they can not only assimilate the people, but assimilate the technology of the culture that they're assimilating.
So this is a highly networked organism that uses technology to, on multiple layers, transcend and, in this case, totally change what the original organism that it's part of is doing. It gives it access. Essentially, you're outsourcing the mind and other functions of the original organism to a larger being.
And a side effect of it too is that like they're very strong physically because they have machines. They're like also part
because
machine.
they get the nanotech
Exactly.
enhancements to there. So humans who are part of the Borg are very strong.
Very strong.
Which is not a foreign idea in science fiction, where you see like the idea of you could potentially have nanotech or other enhancements to human bodies that doesn't necessarily involve
the brain.
having the brain. But in the case of the Borg, it's the brain, and that's probably the most scary aspect of it. Is that it's not just the idea. Oh, so you might have nanobots enhancing your muscles. That's not so scary to some people.
Right.
But enhancing your brain,
you have agency over your muscles. But if you don't have agency over your muscles, and it's some thing that has a nefarious like goal, then that gets very bad. And the Borg are like the scariest, I think, race of any of the villains in Star Trek, because they're not you can't reason with them. There's no, they're not really like bad guys. They're just like, our goal is to go and assimilate you to become part of our collective mind. And no one wants to be part of the collective mind, because then you're not a person anymore, and they still know that the person's still inside.
Yeah,
they're just being controlled. Whatever, it's science fiction, but yeah, it's very scary, and but it's interesting because that's their, they go around and they become stronger every time they go assimilate a new.
It makes it kind of unique though, because I think that the assumption in today's culture of AI is booming. People may want to start integrating themselves with AI. The assumption there is that it would be a voluntary act where you become a cyborg as a way of making yourself better, harder, better, faster, stronger, something like that. Whereas this Borg entity is like, once some people got into this cyborg state, they then realized they would become even more optimal by assimilating others against their will.
Once it became self-aware and things. But I think the beautiful thing about Star Trek, and in fact, I think it's just really science fiction, is like a lot of the themes that they take to an extreme really could play out in reality. Like Star Trek especially, it's like these technologies, these things that happen in Star Trek, they're basically things that could actually happen in our real world, taken to kind of like the eventuality of if you continue it. So, AI getting into your whatever, your muscles and your thing and making you strong. Like, probably my guess is the reality is it's not going to be able to take over your brain. I mean, I don't know, maybe, I don't know much about it, but it's theoretically possible. So maybe in 500 years AI gets to that point, and that's the thought process. So we're thinking about these things now because they're like Jules Verne. He's like, hey man, like, we could put a bunch of dynamite in like a can and go to the moon, and that was in like 18 whatever.
Yeah,
and that's
like,
pretty cool.
There's sometimes an ability in science fiction to be able to see extremely far forward, because you do a projection. You don't even need it to be a linear follow through. You just say at some point you'll be able to do this thing. And in the case of the Borg, though, I'm kind of curious. Would you still think it would be nefarious if people joined voluntarily? Like, it wasn't trying to assimilate people; it was just there, living its own best life as a cybernetic networked organism.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think it's hard because it's machine. So, and actually, the Borg they have like a queen, and she's the one that kind of, I think, is directing ultimately what's happening. So that is like kind of a dictatorial, nefarious person. But I think the only examples in Star Trek of this are there are Borg that get detached from the hive somehow, and they lose the connection with the collective, and then they come to like someone like the Starship Enterprise, and they like take them in. It's happened a couple times in these episodes, and they like want to go back. They have this huge withdrawal from being out of the collective. So
I mean, you'd probably have this completely different way of living. I mean, think about our grandparents. They didn't have this way that we can immediately contact anyone we know most of the time with our phones. It's like we are incredibly more networked. So if maybe like someone who's a few generations more networked than us, they would definitely not want to go back to being, sorry, you have to use a carrier pigeon to send messages to your
loved
loved ones.
Or you have to use a cell phone. You can't use your brain to be communicating with everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, if that's equivalent to them, if that's as big a jump from texting back to carrier pigeon, then I could see the concern, or maybe even pre that. Like, that is a world where you are essentially, you have this massive distance that's almost hard to fathom with your loved ones. Yeah. Like not being able to reach out to parents and spouses that quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. It is interesting. I think the big thing is just the agency, having agency over yourself. And that's clearly what people, would struggle with this concept.
Which is interesting because in the AI debate that's happening now about doom, etc., it's much more about
them against us.
Will humans survive AI? Yeah. And there's so many scenarios that are scary, but very few of them are this Borg-like assimilation. Yeah. But there's another actually character or type of characters in the Star Trek universe that are examples of AI, and those are androids.
Oh yeah.
So
Data.
How exactly are androids portrayed in the lore and in the presentation?
I mean, there's a few of them, but Data is the big one. He's like the main character on the Next Generation, and he was just built by this guy, Dr. Noonien Soong. That was the guy who built, whatever, I just know this stuff.
That's great.
And he, they made him to be basically able to think freely and to be very highly effective at everything, like calculating things and doing stuff. And the only thing that he really isn't able to do is feel emotion. And so there's a really good episode with it was in one of the first episodes on The Next Generation, which I was thinking about showing you guys, was I think it's called The Measure of a Man, and it's basically people didn't want Data to be treated like a human.
Half personhood, essentially. They didn't want this.
Correct.
Essentially, this character is an AI. They're an AI in the sense that they're fully machine. They were built by humans. Yep. And they have capabilities that are equivalent to human in many ways. Do they explore the idea of them having sentience, like consciousness?
Well, yeah, but that's the thing, is that basically Picard made the case that the Data had some kind of sentience, basically consciousness. And so as a result, he should be treated as a human. And and if you go through the whole series of Star Trek, he's very, that's his whole thing, right? Is becoming human. He wants to be human, and he has this goal, and for all intents and purposes, he is. And then at some point he gets an emotion chip. It's this very highly coveted thing, and then he can actually experience emotions.
It's like Pinocchio gets an upgrade.
Yeah.
And is now fully a real boy. Yeah.
And then he kind of goes crazy a little bit because he can't handle it, He was much more effective as a being without the emotion chip. But then he had a twin brother, Lore. And Lore was actually sided with the bad guys, the Klingons, and I think the Borg.
I think that one of the things that is the most, hard to imagine this scenario really existing is that there's a curve of improvement with AI. And any kind of AI agent that's out there in the world and that is equivalent to human capabilities, it's almost as if you'd have to snapshot one exact week or even minute in time where the AI has exactly human capabilities.
Because continuing to improve.
Those characters sort of seem unrealistic in movies like AI, etc. Because of that, at least the assumption of that curve.
That's interesting. Well, but the thing is, Data has way more capabilities than humans, because it's not like he's not level with humans in pretty much any way, except the fact he looks like them and he talks the same speed. But he could talk 1,000,000 times faster if he wanted to. And he can interface with computers and communicate with them, and he can calculate number. He can. Remember, I don't know if you saw, but the captain, they had a new captain, and he Geordi, the engineer, was trying to tell the new captain that this wasn't possible, and they just oh no, it's possible. It's we have
already
we can
calculated.
Do this. Yeah, he knew all the things. Yeah,
it's almost, if that is the case, maybe the most efficient way of using him would be everyone has a ChatGPT terminal into Data. Why is Data sitting there talking in humans in only one body when you want Data's mind, everyone accessing them via smartphones?
Well, because the Enterprise already has a computer core, and it can process probably faster than he can. It's just not a humanoid walking around.
Yeah.
So,
Though they sort of, the thing that seems to be missing is like, the world has been changed
yeah.
in the last year from the LLMs that people have started using day to day. I mean, it's one of the highest adopted, like the highest adoption of new technology that we've seen ever in terms
What's
of
LLM?
the large language models.
Oh, okay.
So like a ChatGPT
Yeah.
equivalent.
Yeah.
And what you'd think is maybe even though it seems now predictable that if a android that could chat and interpret humans as well as this android could, that you'd want the computer mainframe of the ship to be able to do the same thing.
Yeah.
And essentially chat with humans. Maybe there's a reason.
Yeah.
Maybe this is already though too far in the future. Like basically, the computer's already doing everything that humans would ever want to chat with it about.
I think it is. And they can just ask anywhere in the ship, you can just say, hey, computer, do this. And it just does it. And it tells you the answer. It does whatever.
So maybe the relationship with the computer is actually more interesting and more similar to our relationship with AI, or could be with AI, than the relationship with the Android.
Well, yeah, and the computer is kind of like the next segue, and we don't have to get there yet, but with the autopilot flying thing, because it's like that's kind of the direction that this is going in my mind, hopefully.
So maybe I'll take a step back and think about defining the term Centaur, which is an idea of a human AI team. The human still has agency and is part of the team. The interface is like half the body. It's like there's a clear interface. Like, okay, this is the human section. The horse section in this case is mechanical horse. It's an AI section.
Yeah.
So there's a clear interface between the two. It's essentially how you can think of analysts using ChatGPT today.
Yeah.
The analysts aren't using AI by having their hippocampus using some RAM in a fully integrated multiple interface cyborg way. They're using AI by having a clear screen, fingers, connection to the keyboard. There's one interface that they're going through, and the human body is still separate, not modified by any kind of enhancement. Mm-hmm. So the way that the crew interacts with the computer is, I think, similar to the way that we interact with ChatGPT, or like the vision for how it would be interacted with. Essentially, a computer is accomplishing tasks. You still need a strong chain of command because you need a human who's in charge of other humans to be able to resolve conflict.
Yeah. Well, one of the questions is, do you need that? Like, are humans more effective at some things than the computer? At some point. Is that kind of, do you even need the human at some point? And what is the value of the human? I think that the question is, A, can humans do some things better than computers? B, do humans, do they just want agency just because they want it for no reason? And C, is there some value to having humans not have to do as much, because that's kind of the idea with technology, total factor productivity. Like you have technology which helps humans just make their lives better, and that's part of why we have this there, is not to have humans do that job.
Is to delegate it, but also if the computer's going to do it better, which we already have tasks like chess, the computers are going to do better.
Yeah,
you'd want to outsource at least the search. I mean, the term Centaur also has been used for the last 20 years to describe human-computer teams that can beat computers alone at chess. What if a human could have access to the search capabilities of a computer and have a program that gives them that information in a way where they can parse it quickly?
Yeah.
And they've trained at using this software.
Right.
Human plus software can beat software alone, at least in the literature coming out of Park on it. So that's sort of been the excitement about this idea of a Centaur. But if you think about that Park paper, they said, okay, human versus AI versus human AI team, Centaur. They didn't explore versus cyborg. They didn't say, let's have a cyborg also compete, because there is no cyborg on the market available who can say, like, let's get this fourth entity to play chess against and see how that works.
Well, and I feel like once the technology gets to the point of having a cyborg, it's going to be way in the future anyways, right?
I mean, one reason why this podcast exists is because I believe it's a seminal moment in human history where you, according to many people, and my thoughts too, is that we are potentially approaching a singularity, at which point the future becomes inherently unpredictable due to exponential growth of artificial intelligence. This idea was first posited, well, I mean not first, but is made popular by Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near. Well, before that, Intelligent Machines, in which he made the case that when you do have these accelerating processes, at some point the machine will actually be contributing to writing code to improve itself.
Yeah.
And we're already seeing AI assistance in chip design, and of course AIs being used by software engineers over the last year. The insane popularity of GitHub Copilot, which is a tool that software engineers can use, has made some software engineers arguably 50, 100, 900% more productive.
Wow.
And you would think that the researchers who are doing the machine learning development are using these tools. So to some extent, AI is already being used to improve its own code. It's being used by, in this case, human centaurs.
Yeah, right.
But that is the accelerating curve that I think makes it hard to predict where this is going to go. And if you get to artificial and general intelligence, which is a machine that would be far exceed the capabilities of the computer in Star Trek, I believe, because that computer in Star Trek was at a godlike level of intelligence in terms of being able to solve problems. You could essentially have any problem anyone ever has in the ship. You just ask the computer to say, hey, how would you solve this? Can you invent something new? Can you answer and discover new physics for us?
That happened one time in Star Trek.
Yeah, it is kind of super.
What happened twice? Well, one time I think the computer did go run amok. I forget exactly what happened there. But the other time was this guy who was, his name's Barkley, and he was kind of the Dumbo on the ship. He was kind of like blumbering around all the time, not really a good officer. And somehow he got zapped by some alien thing, and he basically unlocked his IQ. Like his IQ was like 1,000,000 or something crazy, and so he ended up like creating this thing in the holodeck where he interfaced with the ship's computer, and he basically he could do everything. Like he took the ship to like at warp 1,000,000 and went to like some other galaxy at the other end of the universe and like showed them these crazy things,
And this is the computer running amok, or is it the
human? He was so intelligent that there's
a superhuman entity.
He was superhuman interfacing with the computer, so he could build things and tell the ship what to do so fast that like he was using the computer to its maximum capability because he was smart enough to do it.
Although I think what people believe, this term AGI or artificial general intelligence implies it's the machine itself that is super capable. But of course, actually, unless the machine itself is taking actions without any human guiding it, but assuming that we continue to have a centaur model where humans are interacting with a machine, you could think of it's a human plus machine combo that is intelligence IQ 1,000,000. And in that case, it's not clear if human plus machine combo with different humans of different IQs is going to make a difference when it comes to like actual IQ of the human machine combo. Will a human genius plus the machine be any better at something than the machine when the machine is bringing all the muscle to the fight?
Right.
Essentially.
It's a great equalizer.
Potentially is a great equalizer. And I think the concern, as some people have brought up, is this equalizer could make humans who currently don't have power, maybe for good reason.
Yeah, correct.
Like angry teenagers.
Yeah.
It keeps them. We currently have power structures that are unequal for multiple reasons.
Yeah.
When it comes to some cases, those reasons are just, and we would say, okay, well now all humans who can interact with this AI, assuming that they can get access to it, are going to be equivalent IQ a million because the AGI can know anything.
Right.
But then you sort of get to a point of, well, it might know anything, but can you actually use it to build? You need maybe to have power to still have a bioreactor or have a way of assembling, whether it's going to be biological systems or hardware to build hardware systems.
Yeah.
But you could see, in some case, you see very divergent views of the future because you see this idea of renaissance potentially. Like anyone could influence a computer to design new hardware, like maybe new architectures for computers we never thought about, maybe new forms of math, maybe new science seems to be, one of the things that seems to be like amazing that no one's talking about is that the Turing test, which previously for 60, 70 years was the benchmark for whether or not computers or artificial intelligence has been reached. The Turing test has been passed, and yet the goalposts now have been moved. And we said, okay, well, AI really actually is artificially intelligent when it's able to do new science. That sort of seems to be now where the goalposts are going is, well, when it can discover new laws about the universe, then that's when we can say this thing is truly intelligent.
Yeah.
But I do think that we are living in I think with the Turing test having been passed, let's maybe not move the goalposts. Let's let the reality sink in that we are living in a world where a new species, AI, exists. This is a kind of brave new world that we are now navigating. That's part of the motivation for this podcast is this is year one of a new era. Let's record from like an anthropological point of view. Let's record what our thoughts are in the moment. Because this may be a seminal time in history, a pivot point in history for either good or bad. I mean, it's hard for us to know, but let's have some dialogue and discuss the import of this moment.
Yeah.
So to discuss more with you and your experience, we can dive deeper into autopilot because that is one of the other benchmark examples of human plus machine collaboration. I mean, there's the idea of human plus machine centaur in playing chess, but autopilot as a term has been around in the aviation industry for what, 40,
a long time.
50 years?
I'm sure, a long time.
And in the earlier days, it was the kind of evolution of the heads-up display or like the full display of tools that a human had. At some point, one of them became autopilot. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I think I don't really know the history of the autopilot, but I've flown planes that have various levels of autopilot, and it basically started with there's like single access autopilot, like on a boat where you're like just controlling the heading, and then there's like
access to only a single subsystem.
Yeah,
and that, in the case of the ship, is just the heading.
Yeah, single axis of rotation. And then they have autopilots that have altitude hold and heading mode. So it's like, okay, you get to an altitude and you can push the button and it holds you there, and then you can put what heading. And then then it's like you have nav track where it will track a certain navigational kind of course, so it'll track and
it'll track that latitude and longitude of you along the course.
Or going from one point to another, going from a directional radio beacon to another one. So it's tracking. And then you have a yaw autopilot, so it controls the movement about the vertical axis, yaw. So there's 3 axes of rotation. And then you have trim autopilot that controls the trim, so that it'll actually like do everything that you would do as a normal pilot with trimming out all the control surfaces.
Trimming,
which that's kind of too detailed, but trimming is like a flight control surface that moves the plane on about one axis of rotation. It has trim on it so that you can hold the flight controls in a certain setting, and you don't have to put pressure on that. You don't have to have as much pressure to turn the plane.
Oh, okay.
Like I don't know. It doesn't really matter.
Is there like a analogy to power steering or something?
Yeah,
in a way where you can say otherwise it would be too much pressure to do.
To turn a little bit. It's kind of like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in a modern commercial airline, are all these autopilots on by default?
Oh yeah, they have everything, and then there's also like vertical speed, so like it can control like how fast you're descending basically, and then climbing you usually use flight level change, which is like it climbs at a certain speed basically, and then and then it's auto capture where it automatically captures the altitude, and then it'll fly an approach for you, and it auto sequences going to all the different waypoints along your route so that it makes the turns for you and everything. And then they have there's a bunch of like a bunch of things that make it so that it just flies itself basically.
Yeah. So does it feel somewhat like you're someone in Star Trek who's able to say, computer, I want to go
kind of
here?
Yeah, I mean it's not quite so cool like that, but it's sort of like that. You're doing a lot of you're clicking a lot of buttons, but like it's doing everything that you're telling it to do when you're clicking the buttons. You're not just saying. I mean, you're not just commanding it by speaking, but...
And yet we were talking about how landing, or at least like the approach to landing,
yeah,
and the landing itself is the part that is still human controlled.
Well, it's not. It's just that you, in order to tell it that you want it to fly the arrival and you want to be at certain speed and you have to get the flaps out and the gear down and these kinds of things, you have to do those things. It will fly. It will do the entire. It has auto throttles too, so it'll the thrust levers that control the engines are also automatic.
Yeah.
So they control the speed. So it will fly and it'll even auto land. So it'll do everything. It'll come down. It'll land and flare. It can like auto brake and stop.
Yeah.
It'll do all that stuff, but it just there are certain things you still have to do. Like there's just like, certain things you got to do.
There's certain things which are almost like human checkpoints. Like
humans
have
to do it.
We want the human to do these steps that are required in the checklist.
It's interesting because it's like you could just automate them, but you still have to do them as a human.
And what are those steps?
The flaps, the gear, the speed brakes. Like I don't know, and I don't know because I've only flown smaller jets yet, but I don't know. You might have to might have to activate the approach.
Got it.
You
So
just have to activate.
And these are still buttons that are still wired to something, but they say this is, for whatever reason, this is still a human doing it.
Well, but no, I think the reason is not they want the humans to do it. I think it's just a cost thing. I think they just don't want to pay for it, basically.
Pay for an automatic,
my guess.
Because
there are some of the new jets that they've just built, the small jets that are like for like rich guys. That a lot of it's like they've got some rich person and like they have a wife or a husband who's not a pilot.
Yeah.
And they want if the person dies, they want the wife or the husband to be able to land, and so they can just click emergency and then it'll auto land.
And what is the failure rate in your experience? What are the ways in which the autopilot has failed or not done what was expected to do? How often does that happen?
Oh, well, the planes that I fly in terms of like the small jets is all the time. They're like really bad autopilot. They're like horrible. Like you can't rely on them for anything. Which
is interesting because you expect if it has poor level of performance that you would expect there to be liabilities and people just wouldn't use it.
Well, but that's why you have to get serious training in that MU2. Like that's why I like give instruction in it. And you gotta make sure
is the plane that you have the most experience with for the listeners. It's the Mitsubishi
MU2. Yeah. And it's just like kind of a interesting little plane, and it's got a lot of stuff. But the autopilot the maiden autopilot that's on most of them is really, really bad.
And they're not doing software up. These aren't Teslas getting software updates.
Garmin. It's not about software. It's this thing is like the autopilot control box is in the back of the plane, and it looks like what was on like the lunar lander. You take it out, and it's got all these like plugs, these little like things that plugs in the back. Like,
so it's not like embedded systems where it's basically a general purpose computer. This thing is a special purpose computer.
It's got little things that are like clicking in there to make it do. It's totally
like you have a new module and someone like you look at the module, it's like a chip like this made from like the ground up as like a module for doing a certain thing on the trim or
it's totally manual. It's not.
Okay.
It's not. Anyways, but I mean, things happen in the plane all the time where like. All of a sudden, the plane's like pitching down. Like it'll just if you weren't there, it would just go nosedive. So you have to disconnect the autopilot. I mean, like it just.
So this is the failure, and I'm curious about all this because it seems like probably in the commercial ones it'd be similar. It's still specialized hardware.
Well, but look at the 737 MAX 8.
Yeah.
That happened in the MAX 8. So my point. So going back real quick, one of your things, the Mitsubishi, yes, they did have Garmin to try to make a really nice new autopilot for it, and it was out for signature with Garmin, and it never got signed for some reason, and blah blah blah, and so it just didn't happen. And
There's not
everybody
much
was
incentive.
expecting it to happen, and it didn't happen.
Mm.
So, but in the airlines, they've got like double or triple redundant. They've got like 3 autopilot. The 737 has 2. The 767 has 3, like separate autopilots that
Like
are separately
separate
controlled.
boxes in case
There's
like
separate boxes.
that sounds like very Apollo missions where they would actually
Yeah.
have 3 computers all running the same program.
Yeah.
In the case of cosmic rays or any other kind of reason that would cause
Yeah.
for them to fail, they
Yeah.
would then just do a consensus. Oh, did you come to that agreement?
Yes.
Did you come to that? And
That's what they do.
Of the 3, there's an anime series, Neon Genesis Evangelion,
Yeah.
where they have a similar consensus between the Magi, the 5 supercomputers that are
Right.
still being used.
And if things disagree, it tells you, and you have to figure out what's wrong and make sure that you have to figure
Yeah.
out what's the right one. And yeah, that's what it does. That's more for the flight like data computer that computes all the information that goes into the flight management system.
Mhm.
It's not really the autopilot. The autopilot just flies the plane's control surfaces based on what the flight management system is telling it to do. The flight management system is taking in all the data from the outside air and what's going on in the plane.
Yeah.
And that's computing everything and sending it to the flight display that's then sending it to the autopilot to tell it what to do. So the autopilot isn't the one the autopilot is just a redundant mechanical mechanism that's like a mechanical thing that does what you tell it to do, basically.
Got it. So I'm not in the airline industry by any means, and you mentioned the 737 MAX.
Yeah.
Can you discuss that failure of the system?
Well, because what happened is the MAX was actually, it really should have been a different type rating. Like they should have actually made it a different plane. That they had to get a separate rating on because it has differences. It has enough differences where it probably should have been different. But like Boeing didn't want to do it because then the companies wouldn't have wanted to buy it as much.
Of course,
Because then they'd have to train new
a lot
pilots.
of unknowns.
Yeah. So what they did is they just, and the reason was because it has these huge engines. The engines are massive. They're bigger. And so what can happen is if the plane, and most airliners that have big low-hanging engines, if you jam the thrust forward, it like pitches the nose up.
Mm-hmm.
So, and with these engines, they're really powerful. So I think it can do that. It's more likely to do that. So it has like a trim, which I was telling you about on the elevator that controls the pitch of the airplane. And I was just reading this. It's funny, and I just read it, and then I figured out what probably the solution was, and then I looked up what happened with the MAX 8, and that was actually the solution. But basically, the trim will make sure if the nose goes down, it'll trim up. If the nose goes up, it'll trim down. It just helps to kind of relieve these pressures if like there's certain like things that are destabilizing the flight from its axis of pitch.
And that's the auto trim. That's
Auto
the
trim,
autopilot
trim stabilizer autopilot. But one of the things that I was reading is like it's like, okay, well, if it trims down and you pull back on, and you like, oh shit, it's trimming down, I gotta pull back, then it disables the autopilot, and it's like it disables the stabilizer trim, and it says, okay, let's let you figure out what's going on.
Oh sure.
But with the MAX 8, if it starts trimming nose down because you're like pitching up and you try to pull up, it won't disconnect the system.
The autopilot won't turn off.
It won't turn off.
And that's a new feature
Yeah.
of specifically that.
Correct.
And they just decided that is a more like I wonder what the reason behind.
Well, the reason is because if you nose up like that, you could stall. So if you get a certain
that's the
angle of
most
attack,
dangerous
you're going to
thing.
stall and crash.
And
right?
stalling is the most dangerous thing that can happen in a plane, right? Like that
Yeah,
point,
pretty
you
much. I mean,
just fall out
kind
of
of.
the
Yeah,
sky.
yeah, right. And that's what happened with the Air France crash over the Atlantic from Brazil. But so basically, but if you read the manual, it's like, well, it won't. You can't pull back on it. So like you're like, oh, I should pull back on it. But what you have to do, like in any plane, you just disconnect the system. And there's these like trim stabilizer disconnects that you just like disconnect it and it disconnects the system.
Huh.
But I think that the guys that in the Ethiopian Airlines, they didn't know that. They weren't trained
On
They weren't trained that was
this new Max system.
Yeah, could do that.
Had an AI autopilot system that
Yeah.
you had to manually disable instead
Yeah.
of normally it would disable as soon as a human took control.
Yeah,
Huh.
yeah,
So like a blurry interface problem where like
Uh-huh.
the interface had changed and humans weren't updated.
yeah. That's right. That was a big problem for them.
Yeah.
So yeah, and there's. I was just seeing something today. This isn't an AI thing, but it's just there's the Max 9s now are like they're the 7s and 9s. They're like grounded because they're not. Boeing suspended the certification of them because they have another problem with the engines, basically.
Okay. I'm curious about this choice, though. Someone
Yeah.
made a decision somewhere at Boeing that in this case, we think it is safer for us to change the way that the autopilot works to essentially presume that a human that is trying to take manual control will still need the autopilot. And that decision maybe was motivated by this minimization of risk of stalling. They sort of
Correct.
thought, worst case scenario, let's make the risk of that be as small as possible.
Yeah.
But other scenario,
Yeah.
we can't maybe quantify how bad that scenario is.
Yeah.
Let's just do a new thing instead of and minimize the risk of stalling.
We won't tell people that we made that change, basically.
Yeah, which is
what happened. I
which
think.
is kind of like these are similar decisions that people make when it comes to self-driving cars. I mean, you have this is a pretty similar analogy, except of course self-driving cars are trying to remove the human from the loop.
Yeah.
But there are so many minimization of worst case, or should I instead have expected value be the thing that I'm going for? Versus
Right, and that's true. But in the airline industry, the amount of acceptable deaths is nothing, is zero.
and stalling will lead to the most deaths, so potentially that's why.
I guess, yeah. I mean, it was a failure of Boeing. I think there's a lot of information out there that you can read, and I'm not like really the expert, but like there's a very clear stuff that happened within Boeing and what they did and how it all went down with telling the airlines and all that kind of stuff. They basically they kind of covered up this change that they made, and they thought it was okay, and the FAA said it was okay too, because the FAA has to look at all the stuff.
Yeah, no, it's just kind of like a sort of realization that all these UIs that we as millennials have been used to, since our first interaction with computers, which in my case was when I was 4 or 5.
Yeah.
Since I grew up a kid of an academic with access to an academic computer lab, but we've been using user interfaces for our whole lives, and a lot of times the thing on the other side of the user interface is what could be considered an AI.
Yeah.
We've been interfacing with AIs, and essentially if you change the interface of how you expect that AI to work, like even when it's from steering to power steering, like, oh wow, like there's now a huge change in what a small movement can do. That interface change is dangerous.
Yeah.
And there have been complaints about the interface design from what we're seeing in the latest generation of cars, where you used to have manual knobs and dials to change things like heat, so you can control these things in an intuitive way without looking at them. We've had an increase in pedestrian deaths.
That's interesting.
In the U.S.
That's true.
In the last 10
I see
years.
that too. Even with me driving, you've got to figure out how to do this
every
stuff.
car has a different interface than every other car, and
it's a risk.
It's no longer intuitive. It's a smart screen that we have to navigate.
Yeah.
I hope that it's just a moment in bad design that's going to be replaced by voice interaction, where you can keep your eyes on the road.
Yeah.
Might also be that people are trying to save some cash in the transition to self-driving cars. Like, well, we don't really need humans to interface much with this anymore anyway. But it does seem like the New York Times Daily podcast did a deep dive on the striking rise in the last 5 to 10 years of pedestrian deaths in the U.S. And it seems to coincide with the rise of both smartphones and touchscreens in vehicles, and this expectation that your eyes are no longer going to be on the road, but potentially looking at some kind of navigational UI, or touchscreen for the car, or your phone to look at directions on your phone, but maybe you end up looking at a text message or something too. Right. So like the humans getting worse at driving problem is actually potentially a motor behind the why some people want to bring AI onto our roads is that human drivers are getting worse, essentially.
Right. It's true, and it's very true. It's very true. One thing I want to mention real quick on autopilot stuff is there's like the opposite, where that Air France accident that I mentioned, that was like the classic accident that everybody in the airline industry talks about, everybody knows about. But basically the guys
and what's the name? What was the date? And
it was in 2006 or something. I don't know. It was, or maybe it was in 10. I don't know, but it was a big one. It was Airbus, like a A340, big dog, and they were flying from like Rio or something to Paris, and basically the guy's like totally screwed up. And what happened was the captain, who is like had like 15,000 flight hours and very experienced and all this kind of stuff. Is it still recording? Oh, good. He so what happens is when you're in flight, the captain goes to sleep to like do his rest, because he's got to rest for the landing, which is the most critical phase of flight. And then the relief pilots come up.
So there's two pilots still. Pilot,
yeah,
co-pilot.
they're still there. Mm-hmm. And the guy who was the pilot was like, I guess a somewhat experienced guy in the left seat, and then the guy in the right seat was very kind of new guy, which is what typically happens. It was the co-pilot for that phase of flight. And so he was what they call like an Air France baby, where they basically grew up. He got taken from Air France from the time that he was just starting until flying airliners. So he wasn't like military. He didn't go through any sort of like real flying. It was just a lot of flying to prepare you for managing the systems of the Airbus, because the Airbus is very automated and it does everything by itself. And when you move the like control stick, it just figures out, oh, what do I think you want me to do? And I'm going to figure out how to do it for you.
Wow. So it is potentially the autopilot that is the most controlling.
Yeah, definitely. It is. And like it won't let you stall. So if you pull back on the stick, like if you take the Boeing, you pull back on the control yoke and you go like, whoa, like that, it'll stall the plane.
It'll stall because at that point the autopilot turns off, as you mentioned.
Yeah, we're talking even with no autopilot.
Mm-hmm.
No autopilot.
Yeah.
Take the control stick, pull back, the plane will stall, and you'll stall the plane.
Oh.
With the Airbus, if you take the control stick and you move it full all the way back, it'll just keep it right before the stall. That's what Sully did when he landed in the Hudson. He just put it all the way back, and right before the stall, the lowest speed you could go, the Airbus just set it down right in the thing.
So he used it in that case, but in a good way. But so I assumed that this was the autopilot doing this. This seems to be another layer of automation, another sort of like second AI that is much more simple, but essentially like, no, I'm not going to let you do certain things.
It's actually very complicated, but it's the idea is that it flies differently because it is computing. It is sending information to the computer to tell it how to control the plane based on what the pilot is commanding it to do, and it's not like a one-for-one linear response to what the pilot's doing.
And it's not similarly where you input, here is my course, here are otherwise very defined numbers you enter into autopilot. This one instead is responding to your control.
Well, if you just let's talk about there's no navigation information. You're just flying the plane in the sky.
Yeah,
it flies differently than the Boeing. Like if you want to go right, you just move the stick to the right, and the plane turns to the right in a level turn. In a normal plane, if you want to turn to the right, you got to roll to the right. You have to use the rudder to like have a coordinated roll, and then you have to pull back because your lift vector has to increase to maintain altitude. So you have to do these three motions to turn the plane. This one, you just go, oh, I want to go that way, and it goes
essentially
that way.
A joystick.
It's a joystick.
Someone's
just totally
So the training is very different for pilots.
The training is different, and also they didn't think that the pilots really needed to be like real pilots because they, the plane just wouldn't let you do the wrong thing. So what happened is they're flying over the Atlantic at night in like in the storm, and they ran into like ice, but it's ice where it was like these crystal ice pebbles, and the crystal ice pebbles got caught in the pitot tube, like which senses the airspeed on one side, and it jammed the tube. It couldn't like melt the ice fast enough, and so what happened is the computer was like, well, I don't know what's happening right now. Like it was like, I don't know what's going on. So I'm gonna let you fly it.
I've got no more model of what could be causing the sensors to be reading this.
Yep.
Maybe it's like this is considered like a out of distribution data point. That is a word for when a current AI model sees, say it's been trained on cats and dogs, and then you show it a photo of the moon, it'll be like, this is something that's not in either the cat or the dog distribution. This is an out of distribution data point. I can't classify it. It's
kind of like that. It's like basically like, oh, I'm not getting the right input of data from something. It's not agreeing with the other thing, so I'm going to let the pilots figure it out. So
and then, it turns off everything, even the thing that makes the joystick.
No. It just. I think it disconnected the autopilot. I believe that's what happened. And so then what happened is the plane, I think, started losing airspeed because they weren't. I don't know exactly what caused the exact problem, but they got too slow, and they're at a very high altitude. And when you get too slow, at a high altitude, you have very little margin of stall because the stall speed, your speed is very close to the stall speed, and also very close to the too fast speed. So you're right in this corner between too fast and too slow.
The air is so thin that you could stall by no longer having the ability to maintain
enough airflow.
Enough airflow.
Yeah.
Got it.
And so I think what happened is that the computer was telling them that they were too fast. The system was telling them they were too fast temporarily. There was like this very, very short overspeed indication that happened. So the co-pilot was like, I think the guy flying. And so he took the stick and tried to pull the plane up to slow it down.
Yeah.
But the plane was not actually too fast. It was normal speed. And so by doing that, he stalled the plane. And then they didn't have these like protection mechanisms that they normally have, and
the autopilot was off.
Yeah, the autopilot was off, and I think somehow the fly-by-wire system like allowed him to stall. I guess the plane, and so then he doesn't know what's happening, and and then all of a sudden like the things are disagreeing, and then eventually they started agreeing, and it was saying stall, like
it's
telling
agreeing,
him he's stalling.
It was agreeing that it was
stalling. You're stalling, and he's like basically there's the cockpit transcript was like he's like what's happening? Like I don't know what's happening. Like this can't be happening because like they're not really supposed to be stalling this plane. The plane can't stall, and the co-pilot, the other guy, kind of knows what's happening. But this guy is the one flying in the right seat, and he's trying to basically push the stick forward to push the nose down. But the thing is with the Airbuses, they're not connected, and so if it senses two different things, it like takes the middle of both of them.
Oh.
And so it was still stalled.
Yeah.
And then they're like trying to ring the captain. The captain's sleeping, and they're at like 30,000 feet, like going down at like 6,000 feet a minute straight down like this, like in the blackness of the middle of the Atlantic. And then finally the captain comes in when they're at like 10,000 feet, and he's like sleeping. He's like half asleep. And then he like, you can hear the recorder, and basically the guy who fucked up was like, this can't be happening. Oh my God. Oh shit. And the captain, you can hear him be like, wait, like, cause he figured out what was happening.
Yeah.
That they were stalled, and they had to like push the nose over. But that was like when they slammed into the ocean.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was bad.
Like the "this can't be happening" thing. I mean, this is the plane that's built to never stall.
Yeah.
It sounds a lot Titanic-esque to me.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
The ship that was built to never sink.
Yeah.
So when you do have a thing that causes it to happen, there is the inability to quickly respond.
Yeah.
To the problem.
Well, and the thing is, he wasn't. Now they teach the guys like high altitude stalls. Like what's it gonna happen? What happens in a high altitude stall? What do you have to do to recover from it? Like you gotta like most people. I believe that most pilots who are trained to some level, and especially ones who have done aerobatics or like military kind of flying, they would know what would be happening.
Yes.
They'd like, oh, we're stalling. This is a basic thing I've done a million times before. I've seen it happen. All you gotta do is unload the plane, let the wing unstall, gain energy, and then come back out.
Interesting. So someone who has experience with a wider variety of planes, even though that would mean they would have to have learned a completely different interface than the Airbus-like interface, that would at least give them intuition to be able to solve this problem in that case. Because there's these two different approaches. One is, do you have someone become super specialized in knowing exactly the interface they're going to be using all the time, and like, don't teach someone who knows Spanish Portuguese because it's too similar and it'll confuse them.
Yeah.
Or do you try to teach someone both and assume that by having breadth of experience, they'll be able to solve problems that they've never seen before?
And that was a super isolated case, right? So it's like that. I mean, I don't know how many times it's happened. Maybe it's happened before and they've been able to solve it, but it's not like it happens a lot, so they weren't really thinking that was something that was going to happen, really. So, they weren't controlling for that eventuality.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that it's happened, and they know, like the Max 9, these things, like they're if there are any events that have happened because humans were not trained properly, no one's going to be willing to not have humans. They over-index like making sure humans are there. because if there's ever a crash due to the fact that the automation made the crash and the human was not there, then no one would accept that.
And there already are a lot of cases here where the automation was the problem. You
Right.
said all the
but
time.
there's even, I think, there's more cases where the actual human screws up. There's way more cases.
But you do think that one of the first ways that AI will impact the aviation industry will be in cost
it's a
savings
Centaur model. Well,
from 2 humans to 1 human.
I think that's the case. But I think it's like the Centaur model. It has to be the Centaur model because then it solves both problems. Because then the human can have the experience to understand what's happening and correct the AI problem, and the AI can manage to make sure the human doesn't do stupid human things.
And that's essentially what we've seen in cars that have some self-driving capabilities where humans still has to be in charge. Is that now the human is the liable one?
And it's what's happening in the airplanes. The airplanes do the same thing. They have everything that's happening is safety that's generated by automation. It's all this stuff. And the last thing I want to mention, and we can dive deeper at some point, I guess, but the one thing that I think is a huge safety thing, which is I've taken from Star Trek, is so these airplane systems have like all these sensors to tell you at the front. There's like a indication system that tells you all the things that are happening, warnings that come up, like, oh, this is, whatever.
These are blinking lights or
blinking
screens
lights
that show you the mean things to you.
Yeah, CAS message, a caution message, warning message. And they're generated because there's some sensor in the plane in like the fuel system, or there's a fire somewhere or whatever, like they sense there's a problem, and it tells the pilot what it is, and the pilot reads the checklist, and then he figures out how to deal with the problem. But what they could have is those sensors, I think, should be like our bodies have neurons everywhere that are sensors. They sense everything in your body, pretty much.
Yeah.
And so at all times what's happening with your body, at least in the near term, with like acute pain and stuff.
Yeah.
And so the planes, if it's possible in an engineering way and a cost way, should have like a network of sensors everywhere and on all surfaces of the plane that are sent to like a central AI computer that is feeling what's happening with the plane at all times. And it can then react very quickly to any problems that are there on the ground, or
like right now it is light is shown, goes into a human eye, into a human mind, and then a human figures out how to tell the autopilot that there's a problem. Or or to like either take control back from the autopilot because of the problem.
Yeah.
So, and
it's not always about taking control. It's not always a flight control problem.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of different things that you want to keep the autopilot on for.
So could this be haptics? Could this be someone's wearing a suit that vibrates when a certain problem happens in a certain area to trigger your nerves? Like basically my elbow means the problem with like the sensor for the ice that happened with Air France?
Well, no, I think it should be a computer that tells you what the problem is. It should just be the computer should just calculate everything that's happening and tell you what's going on.
Hey, we've seen this before. Yeah. This is the likely cause.
And then the job of the pilot is, so the pilots now, the airline pilots are much less, they're not like really flying the plane. Like when I do formation aerobatics, it's like you're just flying, that's all you're doing is flying. It's awesome. Like you're flying hardcore flying stuff. But the airline flying is like you're not actually really flying the plane. You're doing a little bit of flying, but you're really like managing these systems. You're understanding there's a lot of detail and a lot of knowledge to understand how to do this stuff. So the next level is you're like an operator that basically has to be really smart, because you have to know what all these things mean, and you have to interpret the data from the AI, that what it's giving you in terms of what that means and what's happening with the plane.
When you have an incident, let's say that this actually sounds similar enough to some simple large language model that we put together, application with ChatGPT that we put together at my previous company. We used Google Docs to store all of our previous incidents.
Yeah.
So an incident would happen. This is a company that's providing internet. An incident happens and a human describes it. They say, oh, this site is down and these are the devices that have failed. And then the AI will take that information. It's got some prompt engineering hard-coded in where it says, okay, these things failed. Let me ask the question, have I previously seen a failure of this site, this location, these types of devices failing in this way? And then it does a vector search across a vectorization of all of our previous incident documentation. So every time something failed in the past, there is a write-up in Google Docs, like a 3-page in English write-up of here's how things failed, here's how we fixed it. And so then this chatbot immediately responds to the human and says, okay, based on what is failing here, here are the top 4 most similar previous failures the company's ever seen of its internet service. And this one here seems the most similar. It's supposed to then write up. It does like a ChatGPT-esque little output saying, ordered by date. In this date, this thing failed, and this is the person who was on the call, and they solved it by doing XYZ. On this date, this other thing failed. So it kind of gives a quick summary of most similar outages. So in this case, there might be like a similar pattern matching you could do on previous failures. Like, oh, these 5 sensors are failing in this way. That is most similar to this.
What it would be is, I think it would be telling you what the action item is to do to remedy the problem. I think because it would know what the problem is because there's a sensor telling you, oh well, the wingtip broke off or something,
unless like a similarity search is not able to find anything similar. Like the case, the Air France case, it'll be like, it's like actually in our database we've never seen.
No, but it would tell you. It would tell you the left pitot tube is plugged, and this is working correct. This is working because it would know that there's stuff in the pitot tube. It's not just saying, well, the airspeed is 0. So is your airspeed 0, or is it actually this?
So even though that was kind of a new scenario for the pilots, there would be enough sensor history for the plane to do a similarity search and say, oh, here's a scenario. You got one sensor down, it's blocked because of ice. Don't worry about it. Yeah,
or it would just be, and you may be more knowledgeable about this than I am, but or it would just be like, there'd be some kind of neuron in there feeling ice. It's like, this is plugged. I can feel that it's plugged. And so I'm telling you that this is plugged. So this is not correct and ignore this thing.
So I think in that case, though, that would be a new piece of hardware for the sensor.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying is I think this is not necessarily a software thing. My idea is it's not as much of a software issue. It's more of a hardware issue. It's a network all around the plane that is a hardware everywhere that is sensing what's happening, and it goes into a computer and the computer is saying, well, this piece of the plane is, and it's not, and the difference is the human wouldn't want to know, it wouldn't know this square inch of the plane and this the problem there and what that means. The computer would be like, okay, there's a problem in this area on this flight control surface, and we recommend this action, maybe because of our database history.
Oh, okay. So it could be both the database history, but also why not take the Internet of Things revolution where we have sensors everywhere in our homes, everywhere on the streets now for all kinds of things. Yeah. And wait, these sensors don't exist in planes. Let's bring these kinds of smaller sensors.
They do have sensors like that for the critical things, but the question is, could it be safer if it's a full network?
And redundancy, and then things that checks for ice. Yeah. So I can totally see that point.
Yeah. And it could make things more efficient too, because, there are some things in the plane that you just have to do, like de-icing and things, in flight, because, if you don't do it, there's a risk that you could have a bunch of ice and it could get into the engine. But if it knew, oh, there's no ice here, don't worry about it. It's not gonna. They kind of already have that, but it would be able to be more detailed about certain items that you would not have to do because you do it now over an abundance of caution. But now you have more data to not do certain things that are wasting energy potentially.
Yeah, can definitely see that as a next stage of the automation. Yeah, I think I want to put actually a closing question to you, which is, you're not in the field of AI, but you're someone who is, like most of us, now using AI on a day-to-day or maybe week-to-week basis. What do you think is one of the most likely, largest change that AI will have on us, human civilization, in the next 5 years?
5 years, wow. What I've seen the most is people using it for work in terms of helping them to draft an email or make some kind of decision, I suppose, and reducing the load. I think there's a lot of load that people have of doing tasks that really computers can do, and the humans don't need to do those tasks. So I think it'll just make people more efficient. It'll make companies more efficient, leaner, and make people more productive. I think that's the whole point of it. But to me, I think that's what's going to happen. I don't really think that there's going to be like a Terminator, taking over the world. I mean, who knows?
Is answering emails a thing that you think a computer can do? Because if we follow that logically, your AIs will talk to my AIs. My people will call your people, kind of thing. Will you and I be conversing through our agents, and they'll just give me an executive summary of like the long conversations that the AIs had together?
Yeah, possibly. What I've seen at least now is that the human asks the AI to write an email, and then they review it before it gets sent.
But you could think like, oh, the negotiation needs to happen between like party A and party B.
Yeah.
And the AIs, could interact with each other and
to find a solution.
Spend 100 human lifetimes like having counteroffers and compromises and things.
Yeah, right.
And then they both return as like, we have negotiated the best term for you.
And then you summarize and you make a decision. Yeah.
Yeah.
You would have to then control for like any hidden things that like you're accepting, in terms of the negotiation that the AI has accepted on your behalf.
Oh, you still would want a summary of this is the compromise you've reached.
Yeah.
Well, I sign off on this or I don't, and here are the reasons.
Right.
But I do find it interesting that like answering emails have become potentially so boilerplate and so basic in corporate life that potentially answering emails is a automatable job.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is kind of fascinating. Like all these ways in which humans are interacting is actually so boilerplate that potentially they don't need to actually talk to that human. They just need a machine to essentially grease the wheels of the interaction.
Right.
Maybe that thing shouldn't be an email in the first place. Basically, like humans are when you have a company of 1,000 people, that's 1,000 possible combinations. We have a factorial explosion of all the combinations of people talking to each other versus a company of like 2 people.
Yeah.
And so it's impossible for 1,000 people all to talk to each other. You essentially would need AI to allow organizations like that to operate as efficiently as a 2-person organization where there's just one communication channel.
That's interesting.
So I do see that, like, yes, corporations maybe, like, people talk a lot about big company equals inefficiency.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, yeah, you have like 10,000 people working or more working, trying to work together.
Yeah.
The only way you can make that work is if people become a cog.
Yeah.
Because when you're a cog, you have very limited functions of what you can do. You can be abstracted away because otherwise it's 10,000 people talking to 10,000 other people.
Yeah.
It's a huge explosion of network. But maybe AI could allow big corporations to become as efficient as small ones if it managed the combinatorial explosion of communication channels.
Yeah.
I think it's a wrap.
All right. Good job, Darmok and Jalad.
At Inaugural.
Here's to the finest crew in Starfleet. Engage.